Well, it's been a really long time since I made my last video, and I have not done the promised follow-up. Sorry, I have been posting a lot on my blog, so it's not like I have been inactive. I just haven't gotten around to making a video, because making a video is a little bit more time-consuming, requires just a little bit more thought. Even though clearly I don't think a lot about it, because I kind of ramble on and on. Anyway, a lot has happened since I made my last post, so the follow-up that I promised is probably not appropriate right away without providing some more context about what's been going on since I made that. The biggest news, of course, is the corporate malfeasance of WotC in trying to deauthorize the OGL and make all games, third-party games, SRD-based games, make them impossible to make or sell. This is still an ongoing drama. It hasn't actually been resolved. But to be honest with you, I don't personally find it all that big of a deal. Sure, my game was based on Microlight. It had, over the years, I had adapted and molded so many aspects of it, though, that it had very, very little resemblance to D&D or the original version of Microlight, for that matter, anymore at all. And it really was kind of its own thing that didn't really need the OGL, although I did use it out of kind of respect and courtesy and just in case. One of the things that I have done in light of this, even though I'm not really a publisher, I'm just a fan guy publishing my homebrew game system and setting, but one of the things that I have done is to de-SRD the game completely. This isn't a big deal because, like I said, I had changed so much by the time we got to this point that it didn't resemble the SRD very much anyway. But I did, just to be safe, change a number of terms to make sure that they did not have labels or descriptions or anything else that would look like it was taken from the SRD or that it would require the OGL. So there's been some minor changes to the game. I've also changed some other stuff for different reasons entirely, just as my tastes have changed and what I actually wanted the game to do and in regards to that have changed. Like I changed the way the magic system works, for instance. Although it still has the same tone mechanically, it's significantly different than what it had been for quite a long time previously. So yeah, this has been just a major overhaul to the rules. I've changed a lot of the names of the races, again, just because I didn't think that they necessarily fit. I don't know. So we're going to kind of start over from what I was going to do, and we'll get into the background and the explanation of the game and the setting in another video. First of all, I think that as people are looking for alternatives to D&D, a lot of people are justifiably kind of pissed off at WotC and are looking for alternatives. Most of those are looking at the next most obvious thing, which is Pathfinder 2e. I'm not a fan of that game for a number of reasons. I think it's really crunchy and kind of very rulesy and complicated. And frankly, I don't like... There's a lot of things I don't like about Paizo as a company either. Now, I will say that they are definitely real heroes when it comes to the OGL, and WotC, of course, are the villains. But both of them, I was already unhappy with both of those companies, as well as a number of other big alternatives like Kobold Press and some of the others that had nothing whatsoever to do with the OGL, because I had already been unhappy with them for years before this whole OGL thing became a thing. And largely that's because they're extremely woke, and they have decided that having elves as a race is politically incorrect and has to be changed, which is absurd. It's ridiculous, but that's what they've done. They've decided that orcs being bad guys is racist because they've decided that somebody out there probably thinks that orcs are the same as black people, which is, again, ridiculous. SJWs always project, I guess. What else? They've the latest products from WotC in particular have been kind of big flops, is what the rumor mill says. And of course, they don't report sales directly, but what is it? Tales from the Radiant Citadel, I think, which is kind of a diversity, equity, and inclusion remake of Planescape. It was a big flop. Nobody liked it because it's all about representation, and there's no coherency. And frankly, everybody with half a brain already knows that diversity, equity, and inclusion is extremely transparent dog whistle for we hate white people, we hate men, we hate Western civilization, we hate America, we hate freedom. It's just it's a lie. It doesn't actually mean diversity, equity, or inclusion. Just like social justice warriors, they're antisocial. They are promoting injustice, and they're the farthest thing from a warrior that you can imagine. They're a bunch of out of shape, triggered, useless people who go run for the fainting couch if somebody says a word that they don't like. So just as that is a lie, and every single word of SJW, the acronym, is false, the same thing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's false. It's all about we covet Western civilization and the people who made it, who are white people, Europeans, and so therefore we want to take it from them and enjoy its fruits for ourselves for as long as we can before we run it into the ground. So I had been really unhappy with WotC, and that's just the Radiant Citadel, but it's not like that's the only thing that has struggled with this. Spelljammer was poorly received. A lot of people say, well, there's no rules for space combat in their space D&D game. Yeah, and that's probably true, but it's also extremely woke and very silly, and it's got weird furry stuff and strange, anthropomorphic animal characters, and it's, it just caters to this ridiculous crowd, which I don't believe really actually exists in a significant number, especially not as consumers and customers of D&D. Now, and Pathfinder, Paizo, I guess, is really no better. In fact, I think the woke themes have been prevalent in Pathfinder almost from the beginning, even before. I mean, when they launched, was woke even a buzzword yet? I'm not even sure that it was. It might have been proto-woke. But it was the same kind of thing. And you read through some of these adventure paths and other things, and it's just... you just roll your eyes non-stop at some of the ideas that they have in there. So I had been unhappy with both of these. Luckily for me, the essence of D&D, and I use D&D to represent the entire tabletop role-playing game hobby, if you will. D&D, I think, and maybe this is the appropriate way to use D&D, is like Kleenex or Xerox. And there were some old marketing case studies that I did when I was in my MBA class, and we've talked about many other times. Kleenex and Xerox were brand names, but they came to represent the generic. So if I go to Kroger's and buy some generic facial tissue, I'm not going to call it Kroger brand facial tissue, even though that's what the label on the box says or something like that. I'm going to call it Kleenex because everybody calls it Kleenex. Kleenex is a brand name, but I don't use the Kleenex brand Kleenex, if that makes sense. Xerox was the same thing, and this is technology that's kind of gone now, but they were kind of the biggest name in the game for photocopiers back when people used a lot of photocopiers, to the point where people would talk about Xeroxing something on a Canon photocopier. Xerox, of course, was a brand name, but it became so ubiquitous that people just used it to refer to the process regardless of what brand it was. Same thing happened in the South, and I am an ethnic Southerner. I grew up in the South. My people have been Southerners since the late 1600s. In the South, we say Coke, and then people say, well, what kind of Coke do you want? And the answer, of course, is probably Dr. Pepper, because Coke is just a soft drink, a soda or a pop or whatever you call it, wherever you live. So I think that this is what has become of D&D, is that, if you're going to refer to D&D at all, you don't need to refer to the actual game of D&D. You refer to the hobby of D&D, and then people say, well, what D&D game are you playing? And it could be something that's not D&D at all. The essence of D&D has always been do-it-yourself. This DIY aesthetic has just always been the way it was. I know that back in the 70s, when D&D was new, it was heavily influenced by the Wisconsin and Minnesota wargaming scene in which it was developed. But as it moved, and then by the mid 70s, there was a scene that had kind of grown up in Southern California as well, on some college campuses like Berkeley and whatnot. And they played the game differently, and they didn't really care how Wisconsin did it. They didn't care about wargaming, for instance. That wasn't their background, so they played D&D differently. And ultimately, they kind of just did their own thing entirely. I was always fascinated by the fact that Raymond Feist, who wrote the Rift War saga, and then subsequent novels, which were pretty big sellers in the fantasy genre during the 70s and 80s. Magician Apprentice and Magician Master are the first two books, and they were sometimes combined as just Magician, the novel. He was pretty upfront about the fact that he got the idea for the novel from his game, his D&D game. He was also pretty upfront about the fact that almost immediately they kind of ditched D&D itself and said, okay, well, I get the idea here, but let's make it the way we want it so it reflects what we want, rather than what somebody halfway across the country wanted it to be. And to me, that's always kind of been what D&D is supposed to be. Now, a lot of people complain that, well, if D&D goes away, that's bad for the hobby, because what's their entry point into the hobby? And especially we see that over the last several years, as the popularity of 5th edition combined with the popularity of Critical Role and Stranger Things has been a vector to bring people into the hobby. Well, I was around when there was another big vector back in the early 80s that brought people into the hobby. I don't know that that was necessarily a good thing. Some of the people who came in still play, obviously, but the numbers obviously shrank as well. But, again, if you're talking about bringing people into the hobby, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to be playing D&D the game. You can be playing D&D the hobby while you're actually playing a totally different game entirely. Maybe your D&D game is Call of Cthulhu. Maybe your D&D game is Index Card RPG. Maybe your D&D game is Pathfinder. Maybe it's an older version of D&D that's completely obsolete and out of print. Maybe it's, whatever it is. Maybe it's completely homebrew, like mine has kind of evolved to become. And so I think that's, I don't know, I guess I don't find myself overly concerned about what's going on with the OGL. To me, I think a lot of the people who are very up in arms about it are people who are very, very addicted almost to getting the trendy new product that's brand new. I don't have any need for new product. I don't really use a lot of it. I don't mind reading new products. In fact, I kind of enjoy it. And I do read them and I get inspired by some detail that they did, and I borrow that particular detail. Or something about it, what they did, I think about it and I say, well, it inspires me to do my own thing. So I like new product as much as the next guy, but I don't depend on it and I don't need it. I don't ever need it. I've got so much product. I've been accumulating RPG products since, I don't know, some point in the 80s. I accumulated a lot once I got out of grad school and started working, which also happened to be the big D20 boom time. So I bought a lot of stuff then. But I kind of fell out of being a customer. I'm still very much an RPG hobbyist, and I'm still very much an RPG fan, but I'm not really an RPG customer, and I don't buy very much anymore. And so I don't care what happens in the publishing world. And if I want to try and recruit people into the game, like I said, I'll say, yeah, sure, you want to play D&D with me? I don't even know that I'll bother telling them that my quote-unquote D&D game isn't even actually D&D. I think D&D, its brand recognition is both pretty big, but then also sometimes overestimated. Everybody knows what it is, but they don't know anything about it. It's become like Kleenex. It just represents the hobby. And if D&D, the product, doesn't even exist anymore in D&D, the hobby, I don't care. Doesn't bother me in the least. Anyway, so with that, that's kind of my only real contribution, I guess, to the whole OGL discussion is I don't really care. I don't need the OGL. I don't need new product. I don't need third-party publishing. I don't need any of it. My game is homebrew. It's DIY. I think that's really kind of what D&D was always supposed to have been, quite frankly. Even Gary lost sight of that when he got dollar signs in his eyes and he was selling big numbers. But from his perspective, if that hadn't happened and if he just was, doing whatever he had been doing and D&D were just kind of a side hustle, if you will, then he would have said and did say frequently that you really don't need anything. You don't even need the first book. You just kind of really need to have the concept of a role-playing game and making characters and rolling dice. Once you kind of have the concept, a good GM can do all the rest of it himself. He doesn't even need a freaking rule book. So when I come back next time, and hopefully it will be a little bit sooner than it took me this time around, we will finally dive into the Dark Fantasy X game. It will this time be slightly different because, like I said, I've changed a few things just to make it absolutely crystal clear that it is SRD'd. There's nothing that requires the OGL left in it, so I took it off and I made sure that it is completely irrelevant to my game. So we'll talk about that next time we come back, and then we'll also tie it to the setting. The game and the setting really kind of go together. You can't talk too much about one without the other because the setting, it's not just the races and the classes, of course, which I do use those terms from older D&D. It's not just that, but it's also kind of the whole tone and the theme and the way things work. All of that is intimately tied in the way that the rules themselves play out. So we'll talk about both the setting and the rules as we come back. Talk to you later.